Hello, and welcome back to LMJ English, where English becomes unforgettable through powerful stories from history. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that improves your English and opens your mind, early life and dreams. On the morning of April 20th, 1889, in the quiet town of Braunau am Inn, Austria, a tiny cry filled a modest house near the border of Germany. A baby boy named Adolf was born to Alois and Clara Hitler. The world outside that house remained still, unaware that the newborn child would one day leave a mark, one that history would never forget. In those early years, Adolf was just like any other child. He played in the fields, watched birds fly across the sky, and spent hours sketching little houses, animals, and soldiers with a pencil that seemed too big for his tiny hands. His mother, Clara, was a gentle woman with kind eyes and a warm heart. She saw something special in her son, something delicate and imaginative. Whenever Adolf brought her one of his drawings, she would smile softly and say, "You have a gift, my dear. Maybe one day the world will know your name." Those words wrapped around him like a soft blanket. She was his biggest supporter, always cheering for his dreams even when the rest of the world did not. But dreams, as beautiful as they are, often face storms. And the storm in Adolf's life came in the form of his father, Alois. He was a strict, proud man who worked as a customs official. He believed in discipline, structure, and hard work, especially the kind that came with wearing a uniform and carrying responsibility. Art in his eyes was a childish fantasy. "You will not waste your life chasing silly pictures," he would say, slamming his hand on the table. "You will follow my path. You will work for the government just like I did." Adolf, still a child, didn't know how to argue with such power, so he stayed quiet. But when no one was watching, he'd open his sketchbook and escape into the world he created with lines and colors. Those drawings were his safe place, a secret space where he could be himself. At school he was bright but undisciplined. Teachers noted that he had potential, but he lacked focus. As time passed, the battles at home grew louder, and the boy, who once laughed while drawing, now sat silently, avoiding his father's angry gaze. Then one day the fighting stopped, not because peace had arrived, but because death had. Alois Hitler died suddenly when Adolf was 13. Some thought the boy would feel relief. After all, the person who stood between him and his dream was gone. But the truth was more complicated. His father's death left a hole in the family, and more deeply, a hole in Adolf's heart. There was no joy in freedom when it came with the loss of a parent. He drifted through school without direction, skipping classes and losing interest in everything except his art. By the time he turned 18, Adolf believed it was time to chase his dream, to turn the images in his head into a real future. He left for Vienna, the grand city of art, music, and architecture. Vienna was a place where creativity lived on every corner, and for a young dreamer like Adolf, it felt like destiny calling. He carried with him a small suitcase, a collection of drawings, and a heart full of hope. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, one of the most prestigious art schools in Europe. Day after day, he waited for the letter that would open the door to his new life. But when the envelope finally arrived, it carried not joy but heartbreak. He had been rejected. "Your work is not good enough," the letter stated. Adolf was stunned. He had poured his soul into his art, believing it would be his future. The rejection felt like the world closing its doors. Still, he did not give. Up the next year he applied again. convinced that this time he would succeed. But once again the answer was no. 2 rejections, 2 broken dreams. And this time the wound went deeper. With no school to attend, no job to hold, and no family. Nearby, Adolf's life took a dark turn. He wandered the streets of Vienna alone and often cold. He lived in cramped, dirty rooms, barely making enough money by painting postcards and selling them to passing tourists. And then came the worst blow of all. His mother, Clara, the only person who truly believed in him, became ill. Adolf, despite his struggles, stayed by her side, caring for her as best he could. When she passed away, he was crushed. The world, already hard and unforgiving, now felt completely empty. He had no one, no dream, no direction. Only a growing sense of anger and bitterness that began to take root deep inside him. This chapter of Adolf Hitler's life, filled with longing, disappointment, and personal loss, is not just a tale of one man's broken dreams. It is a reminder that even the most dangerous journeys can begin with something as simple as a dream denied. World War I experience in 1914, the world was changing. Tensions between powerful nations were rising, and soon the First Great War, World War I, would explode across Europe. For many, the idea of war brought fear, but for Adolf Hitler, it brought something else: purpose. He was living in Munich, Germany at the time, alone, poor, and still recovering from his shattered dream of becoming an artist. But when he heard the call to arms, his heart stirred. This is my chance. Thought, this is how I will become part of something greater than myself. With a mix of excitement and determination, Adolf volunteered to join the German army. He was 25 years old and finally felt like he belonged. For the first time in his life, he wore a uniform not as a burden from his father, but as a badge of pride. The military gave him structure, identity, and most importantly, a cause to believe in. He wasn't just a failed artist anymore, he was a soldier. The war was brutal. Trenches stretched across muddy fields, filled with fear, cold, and the constant sound of gunfire. Explosions lit up the sky and soldiers lived in daily danger. But Adolf did not run. He served as a messenger, one of the most dangerous jobs in the army. Day and night he carried important notes across battlefields under heavy fire. Bullets flew past him, bombs shook the ground, but he kept going. Some called it bravery, others called it madness. But to Adolf it was a mission. For his courage, Adolf was awarded 2 medals, including the Iron Cross, a great honor for any German soldier. When he received it, he stood tall, his chest filled with pride. Finally, someone had recognized him, not for his art, but for his bravery. In those moments, he felt like he was becoming the man he was always meant to be. But war does not leave anyone unchanged. Adolf saw friends die beside him. He saw cities burn and children cry. He saw pain so deep that it left scars not just on the body but on the soul. In 1918, after 4 years of endless fighting, Germany surrendered. The war was over. But for Adolf, the ending was not peace, it was betrayal. He could not accept the loss. He believed the German army had been strong and brave, and that they had been stabbed in the back by weak leaders and corrupt politics. "Our leaders betrayed us," he shouted in anger. He returned to a Germany that was broken, poor, and filled with sadness. People had no food, no money, and no hope. Soldiers like him came home to nothing, no jobs, no homes, and no honor. But within that hopeless silence, a dangerous thought began to grow in Adolf's mind. Someone must be blamed. Someone must pay for the loss, the hunger, the humiliation. He started to see the world through a different lens, one filled with bitterness, and a burning desire to make Germany great again. This war, though it ended on the battlefield, was just beginning in Adolf's heart. The discipline, structure, and pride he found in the army would become the foundation of his future path. A path not built with pencils and paint, but with speeches and fire. Rise in politics. After World War I ended, Germany was no longer the proud and powerful empire it once had been. The streets were filled with people searching for food, families huddled together in ruined homes, and wounded soldiers begging for work. Inflation made money nearly worthless. What could once buy a loaf of bread now couldn't even buy a stamp. Across the country, the air was heavy with silence, sorrow, and shame. The Treaty of Versailles had forced Germany to accept full blame for the war, pay enormous reparations, and give up land. For many Germans, it felt like a punishment too cruel to bear. Adolf Hitler returned to this broken nation with a storm growing inside him. The war had given him purpose, but peace had taken it away. He was angry, not just at Germany's enemies, but at its own leaders who, in his eyes, had betrayed their people. But Adolf was not the only one who felt this way. All across Germany, people were desperate for hope, for strength, for someone to stand up and say, "We can rise again." One day Adolf attended a small political meeting held in the back of a beer hall. The group was called the German Workers' Party. They were few in number, but their ideas were fierce. They spoke about restoring Germany's power and protecting its people from outside threats. Something inside Adolf clicked. These were his thoughts too. He joined the party and quickly stood out, not as a fighter, but as a speaker. When Adolf spoke, people listened. His voice was sharp, his words fiery. He didn't just give speeches, he gave people a reason to believe. He spoke of betrayal, of pride, and of a future where Germany would once again be strong. He knew how to stir emotions, how to turn frustration into fire. Crowds grew larger, whispers turned into chants, and within months Adolf was no longer just a member, he was the star. He soon took control and gave the party a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. He created a striking new symbol, a red flag with a bold black swastika in a white circle. "This will be the most powerful symbol in the world," he declared. And for a time it was. Adolf used every tool he could to grow the Nazi Party. He held rallies in large halls where thousands gathered to hear him speak. His speeches were filled with emotion and fury. He promised jobs, unity, and strength, but he also pointed fingers. He blamed Jews, communists, and others for Germany's problems. His words gave people someone to blame, and sadly, many listened. In a country hungry for hope, Adolf's promises felt like light in the darkness. He told people exactly what they wanted to hear. "It's not your fault you were betrayed, but I will make things right." Slowly, his influence spread. Newspapers began to write about him. Posters with his face appeared on walls. The once lonely soldier had become a voice for millions. But behind the excitement was something dangerous. His dream of a strong Germany came with a high cost, a cost he was willing to force others to pay. Adolf wasn't just rising in politics. He was preparing to reshape a nation, and soon the world, with fire and fury. Failed coup and Mein Kampf. By 1923, Adolf Hitler believed the time had come. His speeches had grown louder, his followers more passionate, and the Nazi Party stronger with every passing month. Germany was still suffering, its economy in ruins, its people exhausted and hopeless. Adolf saw opportunity in the pain. The people are ready, he thought. They want a leader, and I will be that leader. That year he made a bold and dangerous decision. Inspired by Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, Adolf planned to take over the German government by force. He believed that with a sudden and powerful move, the people, and even the army, would join him. His plan became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, named after the place where it all began. One evening in November 1923, Adolf and a group of armed Nazi supporters stormed into a beer hall in Munich where Bavarian government officials were holding a meeting. He fired a pistol into the air and shouted, "The revolution has begun." With fierce determination, he declared that the national government had been overthrown. For a few moments it seemed like history might bend to his will. But the next day told a different story. The government had not fallen. The army did not support him. When Adolf and his followers marched through the streets to claim power, they were met by armed police. Shots were fired. People were killed. The revolution collapsed. Adolf was arrested and charged with treason. His dream of rising to power in one dramatic move had failed. He had risked everything and lost. But prison did not break him. In fact, it gave him something even more powerful than a platform. It gave him time to write, time to plan, time to turn his failure into a future. Inside the grey, cold walls of Landsberg prison, Adolf began writing a book. He called it Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. Page by page, he poured out his beliefs, his anger, and his vision for Germany. He wrote about power, about enemies, about how a great nation must be rebuilt through strength and control. He spoke of race, blaming Jews for Germany's problems. He painted a world divided between those who belonged and those who didn't. The key book was not just writing. It was a roadmap, a warning, a dream soaked in dangerous ideas. And yet people read it. People believed it. Mein Kampf became a bestseller, not just for its politics, but because it gave voice to the anger many Germans were already feeling. When Adolf was released from prison after just 9 months, he walked out not as a defeated man, but as a determined one. He had learned a lesson. Power could not be taken by force. It had to be built slowly, piece by piece, from the inside. From now on, he would not fight the system with guns. He would use speeches, elections, and laws. The failed coup that should have ended his rise had instead turned him into a national figure. And Mein Kampf, filled with hate and vision, became the seed from which one of history's darkest chapters would grow, becoming chancellor and gaining power. The year was 1933, and Germany was not just a wounded country, it was a nation on the edge of collapse. After years of war, humiliation, and economic disaster, its people were tired. Tired of waiting in food lines, tired of watching their savings turn to dust, tired of feeling powerless in their own homeland. In their eyes, democracy had failed them. What they needed was a voice loud enough to cut through the silence, a leader strong enough to carry their broken dreams. That voice, sharp, emotional, and unwavering, was Adolf Hitler's. No longer the failed artist sleeping in cold Vienna alleys, no longer the prisoner scribbling radical thoughts into a notebook, Adolf had transformed. He was now a master of the stage, a man who could turn words into weapons and promises into power. In every speech he gave, he captured the hearts of thousands. He didn't just speak to crowds, he spoke to their pain. "I know why you suffer," he would cry from the podium. "Germany has been humiliated, but I will restore her. I will make her proud again." The people listened and they believed. They didn't care that his voice sometimes dripped with anger. They didn't care that he pointed fingers and blamed others. All they saw was hope, wrapped in a black coat, standing beneath a red banner, shouting into the wind. In 1932, Hitler ran for president and lost to the aging war hero Paul von Hindenburg. But the Nazi Party was quickly becoming the most powerful political force in the country. Hitler's influence couldn't be ignored. After months of political pressure, secret deals and public unrest, Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. On that cold winter night, thousands of torch-bearing supporters marched through the streets of Berlin. Their chants echoed between the buildings, rising like flames into the dark sky. "Heil Hitler!" they shouted with joy. For them it was the beginning of a new Germany, but for history it was the beginning of a nightmare. At first, it seemed like Hitler was keeping his promises. He launched massive construction projects, autobahns, factories, and public buildings. Unemployment dropped. Soldiers marched again in shiny boots. The economy appeared to rise like a phoenix from the ashes. Many Germans, worn down by years of misery, looked up at the man with the small mustache and whispered, "He saved us." But this new Germany came with a price. Behind the scenes, Hitler was tightening his grip on the country like a fist closing around a throat. He passed laws that gave him almost total control, laws that silenced the press, banned rival parties, and sent political opponents to prison. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, whether by accident or design, became the excuse for Hitler to crush civil liberties. Fear spread through the country like a silent fog. People who once spoke freely now whispered behind closed doors. He created the Gestapo, a secret police force that listened in on conversations, opened private letters, and made people disappear, without explanation. Hitler controlled not only what the people did, but what they thought. Radios played his voice. Textbooks praised his name. Children raised their hands each morning in Nazi salute and chanted, "Heil Hitler!" The swastika, once an ancient symbol, was now stamped on every building, every armband, every flag. It stood for power, unity, and something far more terrifying. With it came a message: Germany belongs only to true Germans. And in Hitler's mind, that meant no room for Jews, for the disabled, for communists, or for anyone he saw as different. He began building organizations that raised boys to become soldiers, the Hitler Youth, and trained them to obey without question. Even children were pulled into the machine. They marched, sang Nazi songs, and learned to see Hitler not as a man, but as a savior. As the months passed, Adolf Hitler became more than a chancellor. He became a dictator cloaked in popularity. He didn't need to take power by force anymore. He was given it, handed the keys to Germany by a nation so desperate for hope that they ignored the darkness rising behind his promises. This was no longer the story of a soldier or a politician. This was the story of a man who had risen from rejection and ruin to hold a nation in his hands, and soon he would try to hold the world. World War II and the Holocaust. By the late 1930s, Germany no longer looked like a nation recovering from war. Under Hitler's leadership, it had become a machine, disciplined, powerful, and fiercely nationalistic. Military parades rolled through the streets. Nazi flags flew from every government building. Propaganda filled the airwaves, and Hitler's face was everywhere, always watching. To many Germans it seemed as though their country had been reborn, but beneath the surface a far more dangerous transformation was taking place, one that would drag the world into darkness. Adolf Hitler was not content with simply rebuilding Germany. He wanted more land, more power, more control. He dreamed of a vast empire where only the so-called superior race would live and thrive. And he believed that war was the only way to make that dream real. In 1939, he took his boldest step yet. On September the 1st, German forces invaded Poland, using speed and shock to overwhelm the defenders in what came to be known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Tanks roared across borders. Planes screamed through the sky. In a matter of weeks, Poland had fallen. The world stood still, but not for long. Just 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. At first, it seemed as though Hitler's plan was unstoppable. German forces crushed country after country: Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even France. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled under Nazi bombs. Adolf stood at the top of Europe, his army feared, his power unmatched. But while the world focused on the battles outside, an unspeakable horror was unfolding behind closed doors. From the beginning of his rise, Hitler had blamed the Jews for Germany's problems. Now, with war as his cover, he began acting on his cruelest beliefs. He ordered the rounding up of millions of Jewish men, women, and children. They were torn from their homes, their businesses destroyed, their identities erased. At first they were placed in ghettos, locked away from the rest of society. Then trains began arriving, long dark trains carrying human cargo to places with names that would never be forgotten. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau. These were not just prisons, they were death camps. Inside, families were separated forever. People were starved, beaten, experimented on, and murdered. Gas chambers disguised as showers became the final destination for millions. This systematic extermination of Jews and other groups, Roma, the disabled, political prisoners, became known as the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews were killed, not for what they had done, but simply for who they were. Meanwhile, Hitler's war began to stretch too far. In 1941, he invaded the Soviet Union, opening a brutal new front. At the same time, Germany declared war on the United States, which had joined the fight after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, Hitler faced enemies from both the West and the East. The tides began to turn. The once invincible German army started to falter. Cities that were once easy victories became long, bloody battles. Soviet forces pushed back fiercely in the East. American and British troops began liberating Western Europe. Bombs rained down on German cities. The people who had once cheered Hitler in the streets now huddled in fear beneath crumbling buildings. And still the Holocaust continued. Even as defeat became inevitable, Hitler refused to stop. He poured resources into death camps and sent more victims to their deaths. He hid the truth from the German people, blaming sabotage, betrayal, and lies. He would rather see Germany burn than admit he had lost. What began as a dream for power had turned into a nightmare of cruelty and destruction. By the end of the war, millions were dead. Entire cities were gone. Families, cultures, and communities had been wiped from the earth. And behind it all stood the man who had promised greatness, but delivered only grief. World War II and the Holocaust remain among the darkest chapters in human history. They remind us how dangerous hatred can become when it is given a voice, a following, and unchecked power. Fall of Nazi Germany. By 1944, the world that Adolf Hitler had built with iron fists and fiery speeches was crumbling. The mighty Nazi empire that once stretched across Europe was now shrinking day by day. His soldiers, once feared and seemingly unstoppable, were retreating on every front. The tide of war had turned, and it was turning fast. From the east, the Soviet Union was closing in with brutal force. City after city fell as millions of Red Army troops pushed through Poland and into German territory. From the west, the Allied forces, Britain, America, Canada, and others, had stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and begun a relentless march toward Berlin. Hitler's enemies were no longer knocking on his door. They were tearing it down. German cities were bombed day and night. Firestorms swallowed buildings, hospitals, and schools. Ordinary people, the same ones who had once shouted, "Heil Hitler!" in the streets, now huddled in basements, praying for the bombs to miss their homes. Food was scarce. Fear was everywhere. And for the first time in years, the people began to ask, why did we follow him? But even as defeat grew clearer, Hitler refused to surrender. He had once promised to make Germany great again. Now he declared that if Germany lost, it meant the people had failed him. If the German people are not strong enough, they deserve to perish, he said coldly. He had turned on the very nation he once claimed to save. Inside the heart of Berlin, as enemy troops drew near, Hitler retreated underground into a concrete bunker, his final fortress. Deep beneath the city, hidden from the destruction above, he lived in darkness, surrounded by loyal followers and growing paranoia. He trusted no one. He accused his generals of betrayal. He sent thousands to fight hopeless battles while he remained buried below the surface of the dying Reich. By April 1945, Berlin was under siege. The Soviet army had surrounded the city. Buildings collapsed one by one as gunfire echoed through empty streets. The German military was broken. The once mighty Third Reich was in ruins, and Hitler's dream of domination had turned to dust. Inside the bunker, the mood was cold, desperate, and heavy with silence. Maps on the walls showed Germany bleeding red from every side. Hitler, once the confident commander of crowds, now looked like a ghost, aged, shaking and broken. He still gave orders, still refused to surrender, but his voice no longer carried power. It was as if history had already left him behind. With every hour, Soviet troops moved closer. On April 29th, knowing the end was near, Hitler made a strange and sudden decision. He married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. The ceremony was short and quiet. There were no flowers, no music, only whispers and nervous glances. Eva, dressed in a simple gown, stood beside him, smiling through the sadness. For a few hours, they were husband and wife, two people trying to find love at the end of the world. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. He gathered his closest followers, shook their hands and thanked them for their loyalty. "I will not be captured alive," he said firmly. Then he and Eva retreated to a small room deep within the bunker. Moments later, 2 gunshots rang. Out. When Soviet soldiers entered the bunker, they found the bodies of Hitler and Eva. The man who had brought the world to war had taken his own life. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. World War II in Europe was over. The streets that once echoed with marching boots now lay in silence. Buildings were reduced to rubble, cities were graves, and the people, those who had cheered, feared, followed, were left to face the ashes of a shattered nation. Adolf Hitler's dream of a powerful Germany had ended not in glory but in fire, shame, and unimaginable loss. Death and aftermath. When Adolf Hitler's life ended in that dark underground bunker on April 30th, 1945, so too did the most destructive dictatorship Europe had ever known. The man who once commanded millions, whose voice could shake stadiums and whose vision had turned nations to war, died not on a battlefield, but in a silent room by his own hand. The walls that once echoed with orders and fury were now still. Only the distant rumble of Soviet tanks remained. A week later, on May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. The guns went silent. The Nazi flags were torn down. Across the continent, people wept, some with relief, others with grief. Cities were piles of rubble. Families had been torn apart, and an entire generation bore the scars of war, both visible and hidden. Germany, once feared and powerful, now lay in ruins. The world slowly began to understand the full horror of what had happened under Hitler's rule. As Allied soldiers entered concentration camps, they found the unimaginable: piles of shoes, eyeglasses, and human ash. Survivors, thin as shadows, stood among the ruins of a nightmare. The truth of the Holocaust was no longer a rumor. It was a wound carved deep into human history. Millions of lives had been lost. 6 million Jews, countless others, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and more. Entire families erased, entire towns emptied. It was more than a war, it was genocide. After the war, the world vowed never to let it happen again. Nuremberg trials began, where Nazi leaders were brought to justice for crimes against humanity. For the first time, global laws were written to define what it meant to commit mass murder, to abuse power, to lead with hatred. Many of Hitler's top officials were sentenced to death or life in prison. The message was clear: the world would not forget. Germany itself began the painful process of rebuilding, not just its cities, but its soul. New leaders emerged who believed in peace, democracy, and responsibility. Memorials were built, museums were opened, schools began teaching the truth about Hitler's rise and fall. The past was not hidden. It was studied, remembered, and used as a warning. And what of Hitler's legacy? He left behind no children, no grave, no monument. His name became a symbol, not of greatness, but of destruction. He had promised glory but delivered grief. He had spoken of unity but spread hatred. He had chased a vision of power so blindly that he lost not only his own life, but the lives of millions. Today, Adolf Hitler's story stands as one of the darkest lessons in history. It reminds us what can happen when hate is given a platform, when lies are repeated as truth, and when fear replaces compassion. But it also teaches us that we, as people, have the power to choose differently. We can build a world not with walls but with bridges, not with cruelty but with kindness. Every decision we make shapes our future, so let us choose to remember, not to relive the past but to learn from it. Let us teach the truth, speak with empathy, and protect the values of peace, equality, and respect. Because history is not just about what happened, it's about what must never happen again. If you found this story powerful or meaningful, please like, share, and leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to LMJ English. Your support gives us the motivation to bring you even more valuable and unforgettable stories. Here are 20 key vocabulary words and phrases that are repeated throughout the story, along with clear English explanations designed for learners. Chancellor, the highest official in Germany before and during Hitler's rule. Similar to a prime minister or head of government. Dictator, a leader who has total control over a country, often using force or fear to keep power. Propaganda, information, often biased or misleading, used to influence public opinion and control what people think. Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazis during World War II. Nazi Party, the political group led by Adolf Hitler, responsible for World War II and the Holocaust. Swastika, the symbol used by the Nazi Party, representing their power and ideology. Speech, a spoken expression, often used by leaders like Hitler to persuade, inspire, or control people. Rejection, the act of being denied or refused. For example, Hitler was rejected from art school. Blame, to say someone or something is responsible for a problem or mistake. Persecution, cruel and unfair treatment, especially because of race, religion, or beliefs. Concentration camps, places where the Nazis imprisoned and killed millions during the Holocaust. Surrender, to stop fighting and admit defeat in a war or conflict. Bunker, a protected underground shelter used during war, especially where Hitler spent his last days. Ghettos, poor and restricted areas where Jews were forced to live before being sent to camps. Ideology, a set of beliefs or ideas that guide political movements or leaders. Ambition, a strong desire to achieve something, like power or success. Power, the ability to control people, governments, or events. Rise to power, the process of gaining influence and leadership, often used to describe Hitler's journey. Fear, a strong emotion of danger or worry, often used as a tool by dictators to control people. Destruction, great damage or ruin, especially what happened to Europe and Germany after the war.